He brewed comfort in porcelain cups, stirred sugar into trembling hands, and watched grief settle like steam on winter glass. In a town that trusted him with heartbeats and secrets, he walked through unlocked doors carrying a leather bag and a promise. By the time they understood the pattern, the wills revised, the tea always poured, the doctor always there, the spoon had already stopped ringing the rim. It began, as so many quiet catastrophes do, in rooms where sunlight pooled. On lace curtains and an old clock rehearsed the same patient tick. The doctor moved through them like a hymn, a knock that never startled, a coat folded over the chair, a pulse pressed beneath a thumb. He was the kind of man people photographed with their grandchildren at church picnics, a white coat in weekend, denim, the summer's first strawberries in a paper carton from his garden to yours. When illness drifted in on the breath of age and money, he followed with a teapot. The ritual looked like mercy. Warm china set on crocheted doilies, a scent that promised calm. He knew the stories behind the framed smiles, a widow who'd outlived her bridge club, a developer who could sign checks as easily as he mislaid names, a philanthropist whose foundation bore his own initials. The doctor listened the way good men do, with his eyes. He added honey for arthritic hands, suggested a nap while the medicine did its work, straightened a picture frame on his way out, and left a card with a handwritten note only he could read. The funerals were gentle things, organ music as soft as quilt batting, eulogies that praised modest lives even when those lives had filled museums and endowed scholarships. The doctor stood near the back, hat in hand, nodding to consolation. He brought herb seedlings to widowers, casserole to executors. He witnessed signatures, only when asked, because he was there, always there, a reliable ink blot in the ledger of grief. Patterns hide inside kindness. They braid themselves through repetition until even a suspicious mind dismisses their symmetry as coincidence. But as the year turned, obituaries began to gather like fallen leaves in one neighborhood. Executors consulted the same notary. Beneficiaries included the same charitable trust. The doctor's ghostly presence threaded the margins of every notice, a comfort that started to look like a shadow, and yet nothing was provable. Vital signs slowed where vital signs had been weakening. Physicians of record signed forms they could defend. The town exhaled. The teapot cooled. In the quiet, the next appointment waited on a mantel calendar, circled in blue ink, as inevitable as the dusk. Clarity arrived in cardboard. A niece boxed her late aunt's affairs, labeling, "Memories with blue painter's tape." June, tea with doctor. July, will update. August, letters. She didn't see conspiracy. She saw the weight of an estate rehoused in a storage unit that ate rent by the month, but a slip of paper wedged inside a cookbook, a list. Of visitors and the doctor's name starred on the days the aunt slept 12 hours straight, gathered static in her thoughts. She walked it to a local reporter known for town council scandals and school board budgets, not for death. The reporter stacked death certificates like dull cards: manner, natural, cause, complications. She mapped addresses on a corkboard and pushed pins for wealth and age, traced a loop with twine. A hospice nurse, eyes tired from experience, described tremors that didn't sound like the disease they were blaming. A probate clerk noticed the doctor's elegant script beneath witness lines he had no reason to sign, except that he was present, neighborly, helpful. None of it was illegal. None of it was conclusive. All of it rhymed. Insurance adjusters had whispered, but money erases questions when premiums are paid on time. A banker recalled a series of transfers into the same charitable trust, a philanthropic vessel that funded reading rooms and winter coat drives. Its advisory board included pillars of the town and the doctor smiling from the annual report, his name under stewardship committee. Again, nothing criminal. Again, the twine vibrated. The reporter pored over pharmacy logs that were public enough to be unhelpful, private enough to hide what mattered. She paged through medical journals in a library that still smelled like paste and lacquer, learning the invisible ways a body can be resigned to its fate. She wrote nothing. She waited, because sometimes the story writes itself in the gaps nobody volunteers to fill. Then came a letter, unsigned, postmarked 2 towns over. It mentioned a teacup with a hairline crack and a ring of residue no amount of dish soap could scrub away. It described a hand that shook only after the second sip. No names, no dates. A warning or a confession, or both. The reporter clipped it to her corkboard and felt for the first time the cold steel of inevitability. Someone was standing behind the curtain of this town's courtesy, and it was time to pull the string. Investigations do not begin with handcuffs. They begin with patience and the stubborn belief that patterns are simply stories with their masks still on. A detective from the county met the reporter in a parking lot where gulls argued over yesterday's fries. She handed him copies of what she could justify having: the map, the list, the letter. He regarded the teapot rumor with the disdain professionals reserve for folklore, and then he filed it anyway. Exhumations came next, not with spectacle but with clipboards and compressors, the quiet machinery of official skepticism. Samples traveled, in sealed containers to a lab that preferred numbers to hunches. The town learned the word retrospective and used it as a prayer. Maybe the past, when measured, would behave. The doctor watched from his porch with an unread magazine and the serene posture of a man whose calendar remained full. Meanwhile, the detective subpoenaed records the doctor had never thought would leave their tidy folders. House call logs cross-stitched with estate changes. Donations timed like metronomes. Appointment notes that documented sleeplessness, anxiety, a preference for chamomile, peppermint, lemon balm. Gentle words that could have been care or camouflage. He interviewed a caregiver who remembered the doctor's insistence on brewing the tea himself. Simple hospitality, she'd thought, like a neighbor who brings bread and insists on slicing it for you. The lab spoke in units and thresholds. It didn't accuse, it compared. It found echoes of a substance that had no business echoing. Not a recipe, not a tutorial, just the whisper of an intrusion layered so thin it rode the line between therapy and trespass. The detective asked for a second test and a third. Consistency persuaded what outrage could not. At last, the numbers formed a chord. The ledger answered too. Money flowed in circles, from the estates of the newly late to a trust that brightened. Winters and added new volumes to old shelves. From the trust to a clinic expansion with the doctor's name etched on tempered glass. From the clinic to expenses that the doctor signed with an immaculate pen. It looked like philanthropy because, in parts it was. It looked like motive because, in whole, it sang like one. At dusk, the detective parked across from a house where porch lights glowed like low moons. The doctor's sedan idled in the driveway. A kettle screamed within. The detective watched. His own breath fogged the windshield and realized that kindness, in certain hands, is simply a better disguise than any mask money can buy. The doctor stood by while professionals opened drawers that had only ever held spoons and napkin rings. They bagged a teapot because the letter had demanded it. They photographed a locked cabinet because secrets advertise themselves in keyholes. In the clinic, they cataloged samples and logs, and a ledger that had never imagined daylight. Neighbors peered from behind curtains with the tender cruelty of small towns, the same people who brought soup. When you were sick, we'll count the cars when you are suspect. The doctor's lawn, perfectly edged even in late autumn, became a diagram of tire tracks and footprints. Reporters filmed the silence, then narrated it as if it confessed. What they found was both everything and nothing. The residue in the teapot read like a long, careful rhyme with what the lab had coaxed from the past. There were handwritten reminders to replenish items that did not belong in kitchens. There were pamphlets on palliative care that blurred the boundary between easing suffering and ending it. The computer told a story in timestamps. Visits scheduled, wills witnessed, transfers queued. The detective gathered it all and still felt the weight of reasonable doubt. Good defense thrives on ambiguity. The doctor had patients near the end of their lives. He was present because he cared. He brewed tea because it soothed. The trust funded libraries, coats, a clinic wing that had saved lives. Intent hides behind Out comes as easily as a fox behind shrubs, visible once you know where to look, but always ready to sprint. That night, rain came hard enough to make the town listen. The detective sat at his desk and replayed the year like a film. The hands that stopped shaking only after sleeping. The wills that moved wealth as if guided by an invisible usher. The photos of ribbon cuttings and grateful committees. He wrote a sentence on a legal pad and underlined it twice. Mercy with a price tag is not mercy. When the arrest came, it did not look cinematic. No shouted declarations, no flash of the heroic. Just a doorbell at dawn, a nod, a pair of hands offered without struggle. The doctor looked past the detective to a street he had walked for decades and seemed to inventory it one last time. The oak, the mailbox, the neighbor's bicycle, the town that had believed his reflex. He stepped into the car with the same practiced courtesy he'd carried into living rooms, and the town finally exhaled. Courthouses are theaters that forbid applause. Every pew creaked with someone who knew someone who had sipped from a cup the doctor set down. The prosecution unfolded charts that turned grief into arithmetic. Dates aligned with deposits. Visits hugged the edges of rewritten wills. The labs' numbers stood like fence posts across a plain of denial. The defense painted a portrait of a healer who refused to abandon his patients at the border between living and leaving. The trust, they argued, was the expression of a town's generosity, not a pipeline for stolen fortunes. They called administrators who spoke of scholarships, social workers who wrapped children in coats bought with funds the doctor helped raise. They lifted up the good and invited the jury to make a moral exchange rate. Weigh the warmth of one winter against the chill of suspicion. Meanwhile, the evidence whispered from metal shelves. A teapot, sealed. A ledger, heavy with neat lines. The doctor's house call notes, careful to a fault. A caregiver described the way the doctor's eyes cooled when tea was refused, how he would gently persist. Not coercion exactly. Something more practiced. Confidence varnished into inevitability. A detective testified to patterns that felt less like chance and more like choreography. The jury held the town in its hands. Outside, school children traced chalk hopscotches on sidewalks built with the trust's money. Inside, an algorithm of motives and means and opportunities computed its answer behind 12 faces. The prosecutor ended with photographs of those bedrooms, those lace curtains, the teacups on doilies like halos turned upside down. The defense ended with a calendar of charity events and a wall of testimonials that never once mentioned fear. Verdicts rarely arrive with drama. They arrive with paperwork. When the jury returned, the room tightened into the shape of a held breath. The foreperson looked at the judge, and the town learned whether kindness can be counterfeit, whether philanthropy can launder intent, whether a teacup can be an instrument. The words landed. The air didn't move for a long beat, and then everything did. Years later, the trust still bought coats, but each one carried a weight no seam could hide. The clinic wing lost its name and kept its purpose. The library added a plaque that thanked donors without carving anyone into marble. The town learned new reflexes, to ask who witnesses a signature, to notice when generosity arrives too precisely on schedule, to trace the steam coming off a cup and wonder what else might rise from it. The reporter kept the corkboard. She removed the photographs of the dead and replaced them with the things they had funded: painted classrooms, volunteer fire gear, a mural that glowed at dusk. She told their stories without the doctor, because they deserved that. The detective retired on a lake that kept its own counsel and understood, finally, that justice rarely fixes the past. It only adjusts the present so it can walk forward without limping. As for the doctor, his absence became its own cautionary tale. Neighbors who had once waved from their porches now lingered inside when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Caregivers brewed their own tea. Executors used different pens. The town did not stop trusting. It learned to trust with questions attached, like tags on winter coats that remind you who paid for the warmth. In the end, the story lived where it had always lived, in rooms where kindness is offered and accepted, in the arithmetic of motive and opportunity, in the quiet spaces between rituals that feel like love and acts that are not. The lesson was not to fear tea, or doctors, or philanthropy. It was to know that any comfort can be sharpened into a tool if held by the wrong hand, and that the softest crimes often wear the softest disguises. Some nights, steam still curls from porcelain in houses where someone is very old and very tired. Somewhere, a clock repeats its patient tick. Somewhere, trust sits down at a table and looks across at the person pouring and asks the only question that matters. What does this kindness cost, and who is paying for it?